how World War I changed civilization more than World War II. There exists a comfortable narrative in our collective memory, one that positions World War II as the great cataclysm, the defining rupture of the 20th century. We remember the footage, cities reduced to ash, the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the liberation of concentration camps, the Nuremberg trials. We've been taught to see 1939 to 1945 as the period when everything changed, when the old world died and modernity was born in blood and fire. But this narrative, however compelling, obscures a deeper and more unsettling truth. The real transformation, the moment when civilization crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, occurred not in the rubble of Berlin or the ashes of Tokyo, but in the mud-choked trenches of the Somme, in the gas-filled craters of Verdun, in the frozen mountains where empires sent their sons to die for reasons that would become meaningless before the guns fell silent. World War I was not merely a precursor to its more famous successor. It was the earthquake that shattered the foundations of everything humanity had built over centuries. World War II was the aftershock, devastating, yes, but ultimately a consequence of fractures that had already been made. Understanding this requires us to look beyond casualty figures and territorial changes. It demands that we examine the architecture of human civilization itself, how we organize power, how we conceptualize violence, how we relate to authority, technology, and each other. Before 1914, despite all its inequalities and injustices, the Western world operated according to certain assumptions that had remained largely intact since the Enlightenment. There was a belief, perhaps naive, perhaps arrogant, but deeply held, in progress, in the essential rationality of human affairs, in the stabilizing force of economic interdependence, in the restraining influence of culture and civilization. The Great War didn't just challenge these assumptions, it obliterated them with an efficiency that would have impressed the industrial killing machines it pioneered. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, few could have imagined the cascade of destruction that would follow. The initial response in many capitals was almost cavalier. Soldiers marched to train stations with flowers in their rifles, convinced they would be home by Christmas. Intellectuals and artists across Europe celebrated what they saw as a cleansing fire, a romantic adventure that would restore meaning and vitality to a decadent civilization. Even those who should have known better, military strategists who had studied the American Civil War, the Boer Wars, the Russo-Japanese conflict, failed to grasp what industrialized warfare would actually mean. What they discovered in the trenches was a new form of hell, one that previous generations couldn't have conceived. This wasn't the warfare of Waterloo or even Gettysburg, where armies maneuvered and individual courage could change the course of battle. This was industrial slaughter on an unprecedented scale, where machine guns fired 600 rounds per minute into waves of advancing infantry, where artillery barrages could last for days, where poison gas drifted across no man's land, burning lungs and blinding eyes, where men drowned in mud or were vaporized by high explosives, leaving nothing behind but a pink mist and the echo of a scream. The numbers tell part of the story. Somewhere between 17 and 20 million dead, roughly 21 million wounded, entire generations of young men erased from the demographics of Europe. But numbers alone cannot capture the psychological rupture this caused. The soldiers who survived, those who crawled back from the trenches with shattered bodies and fractured minds, returned to a world that could no longer understand them. They had seen the face of modernity, and it was a skull grinning from a muddy crater. This was the first war where technology advanced faster than military doctrine could adapt. Railways and automobiles could move millions of men to the front with unprecedented speed, but once there, they became trapped in static defensive positions that generals didn't know how to break. Machine guns and barbed wire made offensive operations suicidal, yet commanders ordered attacks anyway, sending hundreds of thousands to their deaths in futile attempts to gain a few hundred yards of devastated earth. The disconnect between the scale of killing and the strategic gains achieved created a cognitive dissonance that infected every level of society. But the trenches were only the most visible symptom of a deeper transformation. World War I represented the moment when the nation-state fully mobilized every aspect of society for total war. This wasn't a conflict between professional armies while civilians went about their business. This was total war, a concept that would have been alien to previous generations. Entire economies were restructured for military production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, fundamentally altering gender relations.
Governments assumed powers over daily life that would have been unthinkable in 1913. Rationing, censorship, conscription, propaganda, surveillance. The state discovered it could demand everything from its citizens, and citizens discovered they had no choice but to comply. This wasn't tyranny in the traditional sense. Most of the combatant nations were democracies or constitutional monarchies, but democracy itself was transformed, became something harder and more demanding. The war created administrative apparatuses, surveillance systems, and mechanisms of social control that would never be fully dismantled, even in peacetime. And perhaps most crucially, World War I destroyed the legitimacy of the old order in ways that created space for ideologies that would have been unthinkable before 1914.
The empires that entered the war in 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, did not survive to see its end. This wasn't merely a redrawing of borders or a transfer of power from one dynasty to another. These were structures that had existed for centuries, organizing millions of people across vast territories according to principles of hereditary legitimacy, divine right, and hierarchical order that stretched back to medieval Christendom and beyond. When they collapsed, they didn't just disappear. They left vacuums, political, spiritual, ideological, that would be filled by forces far more dangerous than the emperors and kings they replaced. Consider the Russian Revolution. Without World War I, without the catastrophic military defeats, the starvation, the breakdown of logistics and morale, would the Bolsheviks have seized power in 1917? The answer is almost certainly no. Tsarist Russia was deeply flawed, oppressive, riddled with inequality and injustice, but it had survived the 1905 revolution and was undergoing industrialization and reform, however inadequate. The war destroyed it utterly. Lenin himself admitted that without the war, the revolution would not have been possible in his lifetime. And with the Bolshevik victory came something genuinely new in human history, a state organized around an ideological principle of total transformation, a regime that sought not merely to control territory or extract resources, but to remake human nature itself. The Soviet Union pioneered techniques of social control, political repression, and mass mobilization that would be studied and adopted by totalitarian movements across the political spectrum. The Gulag system, the secret police apparatus, the cult of personality, the show trials, the deliberate engineering of famine as a weapon of state control, all of these emerged directly from the Bolshevik response to the chaos created by World War I. But the ideological contagion spread beyond Russia. In the defeated nations, particularly Germany, the humiliation of Versailles created a toxic brew of resentment, economic catastrophe, and political instability. The Weimar Republic, born from defeat and revolution, was democracy built on quicksand. It faced impossible reparations payments, hyperinflation that destroyed the savings of the middle class, political violence from both left and right, and a profound sense of betrayal, the stab-in-the-back myth that the army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but undermined by socialists and Jews at home. This was the petri dish in which fascism grew. And fascism, in all its variants, Italian, German, Spanish, and beyond, was fundamentally a response to World War I. It took the mobilization techniques, the propaganda methods, the cult of violence and martial valor that the war had normalized, and turned them into governing principles. Mussolini was a war veteran. Hitler was a war veteran. The aesthetics of fascism, the uniforms, the rallies, the worship of sacrifice and struggle, were all drawn directly from the trenches. The Freikorps paramilitaries who terrorized Weimar Germany were composed of soldiers who couldn't readjust to civilian life, who missed the clarity and purpose of the front, who wanted to continue the war by other means. When we look at World War II, we're looking at World War I continued. The geographic scope was larger, the technology more advanced, the casualties in certain theaters even more severe. But the underlying dynamics, the totalitarian ideologies, the industrial killing methods, the concept of total war, the willingness to commit genocide, all of these were established between 1914 and 1918. The Holocaust, as unimaginably evil as it was, utilized techniques of bureaucratic mass murder that had precedence in World War I. The Armenian genocide, carried out by the Ottoman Empire between 1915 and 1923, which killed over 1 million people through systematic deportation, starvation, and massacre. This was the first modern genocide, and it happened during World War I, not World War II. The technological innovations of World War I also deserve closer examination because they established patterns that continue to this day. The tank, the airplane, the submarine, all existed in primitive forms before 1914, but it was the war that transformed them into decisive weapon systems.
More importantly, the war established the principle that scientific research should be directed toward military applications, that universities and laboratories should be mobilized for national security, that the boundary between civilian and military technology was essentially meaningless. The chemists who developed poison gas, chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, were not military men, but scientists working at the direction of their governments. Fritz Haber, who pioneered chemical warfare for Germany, would later win the Nobel Prize. His work exemplified a new relationship between knowledge and power, where scientific advancement became inseparable from the capacity for destruction. The atomic bomb, developed during World War II, was the logical culmination of this process, but the process itself began in the laboratories of 1915. Chemical warfare also broke a taboo that had existed even in the brutal warfare of previous eras. There were weapons that civilized nations simply did not use, or at least that's what they told themselves. Gas warfare shattered this illusion. Once the Germans deployed chlorine at Ypres in April 1915, watching Allied soldiers choke and drown in their own fluids, every nation rushed to develop their own chemical weapons. The descent was rapid and total. By 1918, 1/3 of all artillery shells fired by all sides contained chemical agents. Soldiers wore gas masks constantly, lived in permanent fear of the wind shifting, of a canister breaking, of dying in agony while their lungs filled with fluid. The use of chemical weapons was banned after the war. The 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited their use in warfare, but the taboo, once broken, could never be fully restored. The knowledge existed, the infrastructure existed. During World War II, all major powers had stockpiles of chemical weapons, and only a combination of deterrence and pragmatic calculation prevented their use. But in smaller conflicts, in colonial wars, in situations where international oversight was minimal, chemical weapons continued to be deployed. Saddam Hussein used them against Kurdish civilians in 1988. Assad used them against his own people in Syria. The Pandora's box, opened in 1915, has never been closed. Beyond the specific weapons, World War I fundamentally altered how society thought about violence. Before 1914, despite the colonial atrocities and periodic massacres that marred the 19th century, there was a widespread belief among the educated classes that industrial civilization and mass violence were incompatible, that economic development and cultural sophistication would inevitably reduce warfare. This was the era of Norman Angel's The Great Illusion, which argued that modern economies were so interdependent that major war between industrial powers had become economically irrational and therefore unlikely. The Great War proved that rationality was no barrier to catastrophe. The same industrial systems that produced automobiles and consumer goods could be retooled to produce artillery shells and poison gas. The same railways that connected markets could transport millions of men to slaughter. The same telegraph systems that facilitated commerce could coordinate military operations across continents. Modernity and mass death were not opposites. They were partners.
The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. An entire generation of intellectuals, artists, and thinkers had to confront the fact that everything they believed about progress and civilization was built on sand. The cultural production that emerged from this confrontation, the literature, the art, the philosophy, reflected a profound disillusionment that would define the 20th century. This was the birth of modernism, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a necessity, as the only honest response to a world that had revealed itself to be fundamentally absurd. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, published in 1922, captured this fragmentation perfectly. The poem's disjointed structure, its collage of cultural references from high and low sources, its sense of spiritual exhaustion and cultural decay, these weren't stylistic innovations for their own sake. They were the only way to represent a civilization that had lost its coherence. Hemingway's stripped-down prose, avoiding sentiment and decoration, reflected the experience of men who had learned that grand words like glory and honor were obscene when spoken over mass graves. The Dadaists responded with deliberate nonsense, arguing that if civilization could produce the trenches, then civilization itself was the absurdity. But perhaps no artistic movement captured the war's impact more viscerally than German expressionism, particularly in film. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, released in 1920, with its distorted sets and shadowy atmosphere, externalized the inner landscape of a traumatized nation. The monster in many of these films wasn't a supernatural creature, but something far more terrifying: the recognition that the real horror was human beings themselves, that ordinary men could commit extraordinary atrocities, that the veneer of civilization was paper thin. This cultural shift had political consequences. The interwar period saw the rise of nihilism, cynicism, and a profound distrust of traditional authority across European society. Young people who had seen their fathers and brothers march off to die for causes that proved meaningless were not inclined to trust the next generation of leaders who promised glory and purpose.
But this distrust created its own vulnerability. Into the void left by collapsed certainties came ideologies that promised absolute answers. Fascism with its cult of national rebirth through violence, communism with its vision of historical inevitability and revolutionary transformation. Both offered what the liberal democratic order could not, a sense of meaning, of historical purpose, of belonging to something larger than the individual. The liberal democracies that emerged from World War I, and there were many, as new nations were carved from the corpses of empires, often seemed weak, indecisive, corrupted by compromise and backroom dealing. They represented rationality and moderation at a time when millions of people had learned to distrust rationality and craved certainty. The emotional appeal of totalitarianism, its pageantry, its promises, its offer of community and purpose, proved stronger than the dry argumentation of constitutional democracy. The Treaty of Versailles itself exemplified the civilizational failure. The peacemakers who gathered in Paris in 1919 faced an impossible task: reconstruct a shattered world, satisfy the contradictory demands of victors and vanquished, create a lasting peace while also punishing those deemed responsible for the catastrophe. They failed on almost every count. The treaty imposed harsh reparations on Germany while simultaneously fracturing the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires into ethnically defined nation-states that lacked economic viability and were filled with resentful minorities. Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris with his 14 points, promising a peace based on self-determination and international cooperation, embodied in the League of Nations. But the final settlement satisfied no one. It was harsh enough to humiliate Germany, but not harsh enough to prevent German rearmament. It created new nations, but couldn't resolve the ethnic tensions within them. It established the League of Nations, but without American participation, rendering it toothless. The treaty was less a resolution than a 20-year armistice, as French Marshal Foch presciently observed. The economic consequences were equally devastating. The war had bankrupted Europe. Britain and France owed enormous debts to the United States. Germany owed reparations to Britain and France. The entire financial system became a circular flow of debt that depended on continued American lending to function. When the American economy collapsed in 1929, it triggered a global depression that made the already fragile political situation catastrophic. Here we see another crucial difference between World War I and World War II. The Second World War ended with the Marshall Plan, with American commitment to rebuilding Europe, with the Bretton Woods system establishing a stable international economic order. The First World War ended with economic chaos, with hyperinflation in Germany, with the collapse of currencies, with trade barriers and competitive devaluations. The victors of World War I tried to extract payment from the defeated. The victors of World War II learned from this mistake and invested in reconstruction. But they only learned this lesson because World War I had taught them what happened when you didn't. The imperial collapse that followed World War I also created consequences that echo into the present day. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories between British and French spheres of influence, drew borders with little regard for ethnic, religious, or tribal realities. The modern Middle East, with all its conflicts, its artificial borders, its unstable states, is a direct product of decisions made by colonial powers during and immediately after World War I. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, set in motion a conflict that continues unabated more than a century later. The destruction of the Ottoman Empire also eliminated a multi-ethnic structure that, whatever its flaws, had maintained relative stability across diverse populations for centuries. The nation-states that replaced it were often based on the European model of ethnic nationalism, which proved catastrophically unsuited to regions with complex ethnic and religious mixing. The Armenian genocide was both a war crime and an early experiment in ethnic cleansing as a method of nation-building, a method that would be employed repeatedly throughout the 20th century, in the Balkans, in Africa, in South Asia. The war also accelerated the decline of European global dominance, though this wasn't immediately apparent. The financial center of the world shifted from London to New York. The United States emerged as a creditor nation, while Europe drowned in debt. The moral authority of European civilization, already questionable given centuries of colonialism, became impossible to maintain after Europeans had spent 4 years slaughtering each other with industrial efficiency. Anti-colonial movements gained momentum as colonized peoples asked why they should accept rule from nations that had just demonstrated their own barbarism and inability to maintain order even in their own territories. India's independence movement, while rooted in earlier resistance, gained unstoppable momentum after World War I. Gandhi's non-cooperation campaign, launched in 1920, explicitly referenced the hypocrisy of British claims to bring civilization to India, while Britain itself had just participated in the greatest outbreak of savagery in human history. Similar dynamics played out across Asia and Africa. The colonial powers would hold on for another generation, but the legitimacy that sustained their rule had been fatally undermined in the trenches of France and Flanders. World War I also established the infrastructure of the surveillance state and the national security apparatus that characterizes modern governance. The wartime measures, censorship, propaganda, domestic surveillance, restrictions on movement and communication, were presented as temporary necessities. But temporary measures have a way of becoming permanent. The institutions created to fight the war were repurposed to fight communism or anarchism or whatever threat justified their continuation.
The British Defense of the Realm Act, the American Espionage and Sedition Acts, the French État de siège, these wartime powers established precedents for government intrusion into private life that would be invoked repeatedly throughout the century that followed. The War on Terror, with its mass surveillance programs and expanded executive powers, is the distant descendant of measures first implemented in 1914. Once the state assumes emergency powers, it discovers reasons why the emergency never quite ends. The propaganda systems developed during World War I were equally consequential. This was the first war where mass media, newspapers, posters, films, were systematically mobilized to shape public opinion. Governments established agencies specifically dedicated to propaganda: Britain's Ministry of Information, America's Committee on Public Information, Germany's Kriegspressamt. These weren't crude exercises in lying, though lies were certainly told. They were sophisticated operations in narrative construction, in emotional manipulation, in the creation of simplified stories that reduced complex realities to battles between good and evil. The techniques pioneered by wartime propagandists, the use of atrocity stories, some true, some exaggerated, some fabricated, the demonization of the enemy, the elevation of one's own side to moral superiority, the reduction of nuanced political conflicts to elemental struggles, became the template for political communication in the 20th century. Edward Bernays, who worked for the Committee on Public Information during the war, later applied the same techniques to corporate advertising and political campaigns, essentially inventing modern public relations. The line between wartime propaganda and peacetime advertising, between political messaging and commercial marketing, was revealed to be non-existent. The war also fundamentally altered the relationship between individuals and the state through the mechanism of conscription. Military service had existed before 1914, but not on this scale, not with this totality. Millions of men who had no particular quarrel with anyone were compelled by their governments to kill or be killed. The draft represented the ultimate expression of state power, the authority to demand that citizens sacrifice their lives for objectives determined by political leaders who would not face the same dangers. This established a new social contract, one where citizenship carried obligations that could include death. And once the state could demand military service, it could also demand other forms of sacrifice: higher taxes, economic restrictions, limitations on speech and movement. The totalitarian regimes of the interwar period merely extended this logic to its conclusion. If the state can demand everything in wartime, why not in peacetime as well? If total mobilization is possible for military conflict, why not for economic development or social transformation? The medical and psychological consequences of the war created another legacy that we're still processing. Shell shock, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, affected hundreds of thousands of veterans. Initially dismissed as cowardice or weakness, it gradually became recognized as a genuine psychiatric condition caused by the unprecedented stress of modern combat. This recognition forced a broader acknowledgement that psychological trauma was real, that the mind could be wounded as surely as the body, that there were limits to what human beings could endure. But the treatment of shell shock victims was often brutal. Men were executed for desertion when they were actually suffering from psychological breakdown. Others were subjected to primitive treatments, electric shock therapy, isolation, shaming, designed to force them back into combat effectiveness rather than to heal. The message was clear: individual suffering mattered less than military necessity. The dehumanization required to sustain industrial warfare extended to the treatment of those it broke. The influenza pandemic of 1918-1919, which killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, more than the war itself, was directly related to wartime conditions. The movement of troops, the overcrowding in military camps and ships, the weakened immune systems of malnourished populations, the inability of medical systems to cope while focused on war casualties, all of these factors turned a bad flu season into a global catastrophe. Yet this pandemic, which killed more people than the Black Death, is often treated as a footnote to World War I, rather than as one of its central consequences. When we compare the civilizational impact of World War I to World War II, we must recognize that the Second War, however terrible, occurred in a world already transformed by the first. The Holocaust was possible because the Armenian genocide had established the precedent. The atomic bomb was possible because World War I had normalized the fusion of science and military power.
The totalitarian regimes that fought World War II emerged from the ruins created by World War I. Even the geographic scope of World War II, its extension into Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, reflected the destabilization of colonial empires that began in 1914. World War I is remembered more vividly, partly because we have more documentation, better photography, film footage, recorded testimonies from survivors. The narrative is also cleaner, more comprehensible. There were clear villains in Hitler and the Nazis, clear heroes in the Allied soldiers who liberated concentration camps, a clear moral framework that made the war seem necessary and just. World War I offers no such clarity. It's harder to explain why it happened, harder to identify who was responsible, harder to extract clear moral lessons. It was a catastrophe born of miscalculation, rigid alliance systems, and the inability of political leaders to back down from positions they had staked out. This moral ambiguity makes World War I more difficult to process, but also more revealing. It shows us that civilizational collapse doesn't require a Hitler or a Stalin. It can emerge from the normal functioning of states pursuing what they perceive as their national interests. It can result from technology advancing faster than wisdom, from alliance systems that turn local conflicts into global wars, from leaders who can't imagine the consequences of their decisions. The banality of the origins of World War I is in some ways more terrifying than the evil of World War II. The cultural memory of World War I has faded in ways that World War II's has not, particularly in the United States, which entered late and suffered relatively few casualties. But in Europe, particularly in Britain and France, the war remains a defining trauma. Every town has its memorial listing the names of the dead, dozens, sometimes hundreds of names from communities of a few thousand people. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme bears the names of more than 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died and have no known grave. Similar memorials exist across Europe, silent witnesses to a generation that was sacrificed for objectives that would seem meaningless within a few years. The geopolitical order we inhabit today, the United Nations, the European Union, NATO, the principle of collective security, the Geneva Conventions, the concept of war crimes, all of these emerged from attempts to prevent another World War I. The architects of the post-1945 order were often men who had lived through both wars and recognized that the failures after 1918 had led directly to 1939. They understood that lasting peace required not just military victory, but economic reconstruction, international institutions, and mechanisms to resolve conflicts before they escalated. Yet here we stand, more than a century after the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, and the patterns established by that war continue to shape our world. The Middle East remains unstable, partly due to borders drawn by colonial powers during World War I. Nationalism, which the war both fueled and was fueled by, continues to drive political movements across the globe. The tension between national sovereignty and international cooperation, embodied in the League of Nations failure and the United Nations struggles, remains unresolved. The technologies of mass surveillance and social control pioneered during the war have only become more sophisticated and pervasive. World War II may have killed more people, destroyed more cities, produced more dramatic moments of evil and heroism, but World War I changed the deep structures of civilization in ways that its successor could not, because those structures had already been transported. It shattered faith in progress, revealed the dark potential of modernity, established new forms of totalitarian power, created the ideological conflicts that would define the century, pioneered the technologies of mass destruction, normalized total war, and demonstrated that industrial civilization could produce barbarism on an unprecedented scale. We remember World War II because its lessons seem clear: fight tyranny, never again permit genocide, maintain international order through collective security,